and we're going to kick off the second plenary session on net zero toward credible transition plans, and I'll hand over to Vanessa to start the panel.
Thank you very much, everybody. We've got this session until lunchtime. We all on the panel are very focused on the risk that you might suffer from hunger pangs, and therefore be distracted. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an initial conversation, and we've got a fabulous panel for you, and then we're going to encourage questions. Please think about your questions, because I would love to get as many questions as possible, and it'll distract you from lunch. So, you know, it's in your own interests anyway. So I'm going to start off by asking the panel to introduce themselves and just say very, very succinctly, before we go on to more substantive matters, why transition plans are relevant to them. And we'll kick off with Nick.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone, I'm Nick Mollo, the Executive Director of the Aldersgate Group. We're cross-economy business organisations focused on environmental issues. So our whole purpose is to look at how we can tackle some of today's biggest environmental challenges in a way that's not only environmentally effective, but can also deliver economic benefits for the UK. So we cover a wide range of work from climate and energy, nature restoration and circular economy, through to skills, trade and green finance. And when it comes to green finance, a big focus of our work in recent years has been to see how we can improve the reporting and disclosure regime in the UK and beyond. And we're now involved on the Green Technical Advisory Group that's supporting the development of the UK Green Taxonomy. We're also involved with the Transition Plan Task Force to help with the rollout of the Net Zero Transition Plan requirement. So we have around 65 membership organisations. Our members come from over 20 different sectors of the economy. They all see net zero transition plans as being important. I think there's three key benefits or roles that come out of our discussion with them. One of them is around having the opportunity to having a sort of methodical guide for action as to how a business is going to seek to reduce emissions over time, with a clear sense of who owns the action by when a particular step needs to be taken, and what the key areas of emission intensities are. But then the second big issue that comes up from our discussion with members will be around the importance of clearly identifying the areas that are unknown. So, for instance, where greater investment in innovation is required, or where there is still a range of different options as to how a business can change its business model until they can figure out how best to go about reducing particular sources of emissions. Another big area is around interdependencies. So there will be multiple businesses for whom their ability to bring their emissions down to the level they want to will partially depend on actions from others. Sometimes that's down to policy. In other words, you need a particular policy intervention in order to make an investment in a particular technology or business model viable. Sometimes it's about dependence on the supply chain. And that then requires a whole strategy as to how you're going to engage your supply chain to meet your emission reduction objectives. So it'd be great to sort of touch on all of that during the session. The last thing I would say is, from an investor's perspective, if we get to a situation where transition plans can be sufficiently comparable to one another, at least when it comes to businesses from within the same sector, then that can really provide investors with a fairly reliable guide to support their investment and engagement decisions with the businesses that they are involved with. So that's something that'd be great to explore as well.
Lots there, James.
Hi, Vanessa. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's James Close. I'm head of climate change at NatWest Group. And I have some prior experience of climate action plans when we produced one when I was director of climate change at the World Bank, probably 6 or 7 years ago now. I've been at NatWest for a year and a half. We set our climate ambition around our purpose-led strategy 18 months ago, and that was to halve the climate impact of our financing by 2030. And driven from that strategy has come a whole series of activities that relate to the transition work that we're doing. And the first one was to start measuring the carbon on our balance sheet and disclosing that. So we've now published the carbon emissions of 12 sectors, including the PCAF scoring in terms of the data quality, which is I'm sure a topic we'll pick up later on. We've also put to our shareholders our say on climate resolution, where we committed to publishing the climate transition plan by February next year, and that received a 92% approval at AGM in May, which was obviously very reassuring. And we've really started work on the climate transition plans very seriously. The accountability lies with me and my team and the finance team within the bank, and we present these climate transition plans to our climate executive steering group, which involves most of ExCo and is chaired by the head of strategy and ventures and the head of risk, and our CEO sits on that committee as well. But it is challenging, and really looking forward to talking about some of the challenges and opportunities that sit around it. And I think builds on a lot of the work that we've already done in terms of TCFD, and I think also will be really central to the way in which we think about the commitments we've made around GFANZ and SBTI, which I think are fundamental to what we're doing here. And of course we see, not just challenges in terms of carbon measurement and sector versus systems issues that we're dealing with, but also opportunities. Nick Stern advises us and reminds us that climate change is the opportunity of the 21st century. So if we can get our climate finance aligned with the economic transition, we believe this is going to be a great opportunity for us as a business, but also help us live out our purpose of helping our customers thrive.
I love the opportunity side. It's much neglected. Bella.
Hi, I'm Bella Landymore. I'm Policy Director at the Impact Investing Institute. We were set up 3 years ago to grow the market for impact investing. Specifically, that is finance seeking to have a positive impact and a financial return. And that's across the mainstream markets predominantly. And we've obviously seen a huge growth of that over the last few years anyway. And we do this through raising awareness, through education, through convening all the different necessary actors across the ecosystem. We produce policy recommendations, research, we run events. And we're on the Transition Plan Task Force. We have a particular focus on the S in ESG, if you like. There's no climate impact without social impact, and we know strongly that if we don't grow our focus on climate and environmental impact to bring in the people and the communities affected by climate change, then we won't be able to transition to net zero, particularly not effectively. And so we're bringing that to the Transition Plan Task Force and ensuring that they take into account the considerations of the workforce, of the communities in which organisations operate, and globally, the different geographies in which they operate and their supply chains operate.
Thank you very much. And I'm Vanessa Habbard-Williams. I run the environment practice at Linklaters, and I also coordinate ESG across the firm. And I think we did advice on our first transition plan probably about 18 months ago. And since then, just the pace of change and the pace of engagement and development of guidance has really ramped up enormously in the last 6 months. So just to contextualise, we're looking at credible transition plans, credible, effective transition plans. And you'll remember that at Glasgow at COP26, there was the UK's announcement of an expectation to require disclosure where you've got, where a company has got, a listed company or a financial institution has got targets as to its plan to deliver on those targets. And the TPT, the Transition Plan Task Force, is tasked with developing guidance to support that. They have published a call for evidence. You have 8 more days to get your submission in. Please get them in, the more the better. And if you look at the call for evidence, there is a really good piece of work that the Secretariat has done in looking at the different forms of guidance as to what are the components of a transition plan. And I think they list about 11 or 12, but essentially they are covering ambition, target setting, management, which is how do these things get nutted out and included in business plans, in capital allocation plans, in operations plans, internal policies and governance, plans for products and services, and then a huge piece around engagement. So engagement, we talked about value chains, but also portfolio engagement, public sector engagement, industry engagement, metrics and monitoring, skills, incentives and accountability, and governance. So within that you can see that actually transition plans are quite a chunky piece of work. I suspect the disclosure is the little bit of the glacier that sticks up above the sea, and then there's a huge amount of work that goes underneath that informs the disclosure. It's like any kind of disclosure-led mechanism. Actually, the disclosure is the pinnacle. So that's really what we're talking about today. And if I turn to Nick first, so real economy predominantly, in terms of what an effective plan is, what's important to make a plan effective, and what are the boundaries as to what a good transition plan can do?
So it's a good question. So I think that the starting point has to be to provide a holistic overview of where your emissions come from as a business. And that's going to require providing a clear picture of your emissions that you both directly control, and such as Scope 1 and to an extent Scope 2, and those that you have much less control over, which is the Scope 3 emissions, which is where the whole value chain comes in. And clearly the latter is very challenging, and I think we're going to have to start on a voluntary basis before it becomes mandatory. But ultimately that's what you want. You want a really good overview of a business's sources of emissions, and getting a really good sense of where the crunch points are. What are the sources where business is particularly carbon intensive? I think an effective transition plan, and we've spoken a lot to our members about this, has to really be different to what we've seen so far in terms of disclosure. So I've at times heard people describe the transition plan as another form of TCFD, another form of climate risk reporting. And I would see this completely differently. For me, it has to be focused on actions. So you've established where your sources of emissions are coming from. What are you going to do about them? What is the plan? So which part of your business is going to own a particular action? When are you setting intermediary steps to reduce emissions on the way to net zero? And what specifically are the actions you're going to take? Now, alongside that, I think it's really important to be transparent about the things you don't know, or the areas where you rely on others. And I think that's a really important part of a plan. So that some of our members come, for example, from energy-intensive sectors such as steel, cement, chemicals. Others are involved in other parts of heavy manufacturing, where the immediate answer as to how you're going to reduce even some of your Scope 1 and 2 emissions is not always obvious. So they will know where to go for the first 30% of emission cuts. The next 30% is less obvious. There may be 2 or 3 options. So if you take the case of cement, a lot of the time your first 30 to 40% emission cuts, you'll probably get them by energy efficiency gains if you've not already done them, but then possibly through greater investment in resource efficiency and reusing and recycling as much as you possibly can. But then you'll probably need a combination of either bioenergy or CCS or something else to help you cut emissions for the last 30%. But you may not know the answer in 2022, so you need to be quite upfront about that and have a clear approach to innovation here. But interdependencies is just as important. So there are areas where some business investments, and again I think energy-intensive companies are a good example here, will really depend on the policy landscape being right. So if you as a business basically just need to decarbonize your fleet and get your electricity 100% from renewables, you don't really need that much more policy interventions to get there. I mean, there are still some uncertainties, but there's a fairly clear, relatively speaking, policy landscape to be able to invest in these technologies. But actually, if you're waiting for, if you need green hydrogen, or if you need another form of low carbon fuel that's not yet available at scale, or you need carbon capture and storage to capture a remaining part of your emissions, then actually you need the right kind of policy mechanisms to be available. So, for example, in the case of heavy industries, having product standards that provide climate criteria for industrial goods, which become tighter over time, could be a really good way of creating a market for low carbon cement, low carbon steel, which then helps create a business case for investing in the technologies you need to decarbonize your operations. But given the upfront costs of decarbonizing your operations, you're not going to do it unless you know that there's a market for your product because the right policies have been put in place. So I think really being able to highlight those interdependencies is really useful for the business, but it's actually extremely useful for policymakers as well, who can then understand where the key policy gaps are and what needs to be addressed in priority. I would then just very briefly just make a point about skills and supply chain engagement. One of the things we do within the Aldersgate Group is, outside of our policy work, we do a lot of knowledge hubs, whereby every month our members meet and talk about common challenges. And just last week we had a really good knowledge hub of about 20 of our members where they were all comparing their net zero strategy and comparing what they found difficult and not difficult. And two things that stood out. One of them was supply chain engagement. So I always think that a lot of our big members at Nestle, Tesco, BT and others have a few thousand suppliers, and I'm always reminded, no, it's 20,000, it's 30,000, it's 40,000. And so it's a hugely, to cut emissions in your supply chain is a huge exercise. And so more and more of them are now developing strategies where they pick the first 100, the largest 100, try and develop the strategies with them and help them develop their own sort of approach to cutting emissions. Then they go to the next 500 and so on. But there's a huge amount of, I think, guidance and knowledge sharing that's required in that area. And internally, the second big challenge they often quote is around skilling staff up. They often sort of start their net zero journey by thinking, well, look, we need to make sure that the Department of Corporate Affairs, Department of Environment has everything they need to go on that journey, and actually realize a legal scoring every 5 minutes to understand the implications of this and that. Even the HR department needs to be better informed about climate and biodiversity targets and what it means for them. And they realize that the entire business needs to be skilled up. And again, sort of providing the right materials, the forum through which you can train staff in multiple locations, sometimes across multiple jurisdictions, is quite a task, but you need a strategy for that. And I think a net zero transition plan can be a good place to get that going.
So just in relation to the UK's activity on transition plans, I'm very conscious that we saw the Climate Change Committee put out their report last week. And Chris Stark is very keen on focusing on how do you actually deliver emission reductions rather than a lot of plans, but it's emissions still going up.
Yep.
That's actually very hard to do. How to what extent are we hanging too much on disclosure and transition plans?
I mean, it's a really good question. So first and foremost, I think disclosure is important, reporting is important, but it doesn't replace the need to have the right policies in place in the real economy to get things done. So you can get businesses to report in as green a way as possible and to be as transparent as they can about their exposure to climate risk, for example, without anything changing on the ground. So, we published a report that's on our website called our Net Zero Policy Tracker, where we looked on a sector-by-sector basis at the areas where policy is currently insufficient. So on power, we're doing okay, albeit we could do a lot more on grids, because 50 gigawatt of offshore wind by the end of the decade, doable, but not if you don't think about the grid. And at the moment, we're not focusing enough on the grid, focusing more on the project. So we need to address that. If you look at heavy industry sectors, we have a range of innovation pots, which is really good, but we don't yet have clear business models in place for how we're going to roll out CCS and hydrogen at scale. We don't yet have product standards that can help create a market for low carbon industrial products. We need to do all these things as a matter of urgency in order to ensure that better reporting also leads to better decisions. But to have better decisions, you need the right policies in place to create a market for the things you're trying to do. And that's particularly important when you have to incur very high capex in order to change your production model to completely decarbonise your operations. So they are, without question, you can't just focus on the green finance side, sort of reporting side of things. We have to make sure that we plug the gap that remain in a net zero strategy. But I would say the thing I think is really positive about transition plans is the fact that they are meant to focus on actions as opposed to just say, oh, here are my emissions, and that's it. It's really supposed to be a plan to help a business explain how it will go about cutting its emissions and help investors explain how they will go about decarbonising their own portfolios by engaging, not divesting, but by engaging with the businesses that they invest in. So I think that's that's an important step forward in the reporting journey. So I really think you need both. You need action-oriented transition plans, and you need to plug the key, most urgent policy gaps in areas like power, heavy industry, buildings. Buildings, another one. We have no energy efficiency regulations outside of the rented sector ready to sort of say, to mandate that all buildings in the country should reach a particular level of efficiency by a particular date. And yet that's one of the easiest sources of emission reductions that we can deliver. So we really need to see those sorts of gaps being plugged.
It's extraordinary, actually. I was thinking I first advised on carbon capture in 2005, 2004, and the same on energy efficiency in real estate, and yet, I'm going to be retired by the time we actually get the wriggle on.
Well, I remember discussions with a range of businesses, MPs, government officials in the late 2000s where ideas around the Green Deal were formulating, and there was real belief in the room that by 2020 we will have sorted it, and most buildings will be at very high levels of energy efficiency. But I think sometimes you've got to realise that it's not just a technological transition. You have to take people on board with you, and when you are looking at areas like buildings, people live in buildings, work in buildings, and you really need to think about the kind of regulations, incentives, skills support, information campaign that you need to put in place to generally take people on that journey and make sure they have the information they need, they have confidence in the people doing the work, and especially when it comes to their own homes. And we've never really put such a holistic strategy in place for buildings that covers all of those things, the sort of clear regulatory standard, but also the clear incentives that people need, the information that people need to get there, the certification system to make sure that you haven't got cowboys coming to your home doing very poor insulation or dodgy heat pump installation. It's all done properly. And I think
we'll have to get you in the programme. We'll have to get you on the telly explaining.
The reason, sorry, and I don't want to go on a tangent about buildings, but I have just tried to get a heat pump installed, and it's been an absolute total nightmare. So,
we'll swap stories because I'm doing it at the moment.
Great.
James, financial institutions. How is NatWest engaging? And tell us a little bit about your sectoral approach.
Yeah, I think so. We have a whole economy view because we're a bank. And of course, there's two aspects, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which we deal with in terms of getting our own house in order, but really it's all about our financed emissions, and that's the vast bulk of our emissions, of course. So we think about 6 things. The first thing is ambition. So we've got our 2030 target, and we've got our 2050 net zero commitment. So I think when you're thinking about transition, I think it's really important to think about what you're transitioning to, and what your intermediate stage might be, which is where we have the net zero 2050 and then the 2030, and that focuses our mind. And I think, for us, that helps us with the challenge of greenwashing, which Emma Howard-Boyd was talking about, because if it's not authentically aligned to those targets, then it's not delivering the change that we require. So, number 1, ambition. 2, data-driven. We started measuring the carbon on our sectors 2 years ago and started reporting on it 2 years ago. And as I said, in our latest climate-related disclosures report, we've taken that further. And we've used carbon as the primary driver, but it doesn't mean that we don't care about some of the other things that are really important in terms of nature and biodiversity and social, which are, in many ways harder to measure. But the focus on carbon as the primary measurement keeps our teams and everybody focused on what we're trying to achieve. The third thing I think is systemic. So the risk of approaching this through a sector-based view is the way we think about sectors today won't be the way in which sectors look in 2030. And we have to remind ourselves that what the economy might look like in 2030, and this is where the Climate Change Committee have done a fantastic job of setting out those targets and pathways. And we use, for example, very specific examples. You know, imagine if we'd thought about this 20 years ago, what would we have thought about renewables and where the renewable sector is going today? And I think NatWest did a great job, and Rishi's here, of pushing the renewables industry that gave us a market-leading position, because we're thinking about it in terms of how it connected with the energy system as a whole. So systemic, I think, is really important. The other one example is batteries. You know, where would you put batteries in your sectors? It probably sits in advanced manufacturing, but actually it's going to be the enabler of the transition. Yeah. So it's going to sit around generation, distribution, electric vehicles, and also home retrofits as well. So that forces you to think about system-wide change and what that means for the way in which we will do business in the future. Which leads to the next area, which is integrated. So, you know, one of the really interesting things about the way in which banks think about what they do is of the allocation of capital. And every single banker knows what their capital allocation process is, how that ties to credit, and what that will do to make money move. So we want to integrate the capital allocation program to carbon and carbon measurement. Now, I'm not saying that we've got the answer for that, but that's a really important piece of work that sits at the centre of the climate transition plan. And we're looking to use a shadow price of carbon to make those allocations as effectively as possible. And if you think about our 2030 target, we're going to have to reduce probably about 7% per annum our carbon from where it is today to get to that 2030 target. So each year we'll have to think about what the carbon is on our balance sheet, how we measure it, and how we get to the point where we need to get to, which is why it all needs to be integrated and tie up in an effective way. Then the next area is transparency, you know, reporting, holding ourselves to account, putting it out into the public domain, and enabling people to interrogate what we do and work out what that means for them. And you know, we think that's really important in the context of our shareholders. We've got some impact funds that really love the way in which we're disciplined about carbon and how we think about it, but obviously want to hold us to account on the basis of what we report. And I think the final point I would make is that it needs to be aligned. And I think this is the power of GFANZ. And you know, we saw this at the COP when Mark Carney really announced the 130 trillion worth of commitments that sit around GFANZ. That alignment between asset owners, fund managers, banks, and the real economy becomes really important. And I think in particular, the real economy piece, because that's where we drive our lending towards the change in the financial system, which means that we will lend at a more cost-effective rate for those that are doing things that are more aggressively carbon-oriented. But we also need to give people the tools that enable them to measure that, which is why we've launched last week our Carbon Planner, which helps people work out what their current carbon footprint is and what they can do to reduce it. And ultimately, when the financial system ends up in its destination as to where it needs to be, all our lending will align with companies and the businesses and potentially an individual's expectation of what their carbon reduction commitments are going to be. And if they deliver that, then that's great. If they outperform it and do better, then you know, sustainability loan would suggest you get a discount for your lending. Of course, if you don't, there should be penalties, and this should all fit in to our lending covenants and the terms of our lending. So that's kind of the ambition, but of course easy to say, but quite challenging to deliver.
Yeah, it's always quite hard when you're looking at the specifics. Just in a world where we've got an amazingly high oil price and sort of multiple crises that we're navigating, and where we've got some of that policy gap, how do you assess whether clients in high emitting sectors are transitioning in the way that you'd want, and is the impact effectively, once you've made your determination,
how much they're going to pay for capital. And that
Well,
sounds like it.
Yeah, well, we've done that through the work that we've done on oil and gas and coal in our what we call credible transition plan assessment of oil and gas majors and big coal companies. And we've looked at what their plans say in terms of temperature alignment, and then we've evaluated whether we think that's consistent with a credible transition plan. And of course, a lot of oil and gas companies are also aggressively moving towards the renewables
Yes.
sector. So we want to make sure that we're supporting that type of transition. But those that don't fit, we've basically broken off our banking relationship with them and will reduce our exposures. And again, you know, that's all in our climate-related disclosures report. So oil and gas and coal are quite easy. What's more difficult is agriculture, for example. So it's you know, around about 20% of the emissions on our balance sheet, but a relatively small proportion of our lending. Now, we're not going to stop banking farmers because, you know, they are an essential part of the economy. But what we want to do is help them reduce their emissions and work in partnership and collaboration with others so that we give them the tools that enable them to put in place carbon reduction measures, whether that's, you know, renewable energy, heat pumps, biogas digesters, and help them think about the challenge they face today in terms of fertilizer, feed and fuel increments that turns that from a P&L problem that they've got, it's going to cost them money, to using capital to bring the cash flow and balance sheet that enable them to bridge that gap and make that transition. And that's where we see this as a potential investment opportunity, as well as, of course, a huge challenge in terms of the way in which we decarbonise.
And just touching on that, I mean, when I talk to people in the city every so often, I still get quite a gulf where there's quite a lot of education. In terms of where you're engaging with SMEs who've probably had less attention focused on communication with them in terms of what all of this means, do you find there's appetite? Do you find there's still a lack of appreciation of how quickly this is moving? Just curious.
Yeah, well, and we did some research ahead of COP, which showed that I think it was 87% of SMEs wanted to do something around sustainability, but around half didn't know where to start. So that's why we gave them the access to the carbon planner, which enables them to get that starting point. And I think then also, you know, we need to think about how SMEs fit into supply chains for businesses generally. I think it's something like 75% of them see themselves as part of somebody else's supply chain. And if their supply chain is moving to net zero, then, you know, you want to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And I think that also then helps us create this narrative that there is opportunity here as well in terms of what our analysis showed. There's a UK £130 billion opportunity for SMEs, and also 160,000 and an opportunity to create 130,000 jobs as well. So that becomes, you know, another framing of this with our SME customers. And then we give, you know, again, we're at the early stages of this, so we use green loans, where use of proceeds loans, which enable them to get a, you know, fee waiver if they want to invest the money into low carbon technologies. But you know, it's a starting point. There's much more to do on it. But actually, there's a pretty good engagement around it.
That's really interesting. That, Bella, coming to you, that last piece just starts to touch on the importance of just transition. Can you articulate why just transition is so important?
Yeah, of course. So just transition, to break it down, it's a transition that to net zero that is executed in a fair and inclusive way. That has three parts to it. It's climate and environmental action. It's socioeconomic equity and distribution, and it's community voice. And that last part is really, really hard, but the most important, and it touches on some of the SME challenges that you raise. So why is it important? I think, to touch on everything that everyone said, the transition plans highlight the fact that we've got rhetoric, we've got targets, but we've got to take action. How do we meet these targets? What are we going to do? And when you think about what you're going to do, what are you you're transitioning your business to net zero. And that is a transition across so many different factors, whether it's your workforce, where you operate, all of the implications along the supply chain that we've talked about, and that's in the UK and globally. And they're in increasing sort of layers of distance from your control, if you like. But what are the knock-on impacts on people and communities? And Vanessa touched on at the beginning in transition plans, the way that the sector neutral framework is currently being proposed is it's got all of these different sub-elements, hasn't it? All the way through strategy and governance and measurement and reporting and targets. And really, that's there to help. And if you put just transition at the heart of that, so not just reducing your carbon emissions to zero, but what the impact of reducing your carbon emissions to zero is on all those different factors. So you put just transition at the heart of all of those different elements, then you start to think about your business as a whole, rather than just as a target, if you like, this net zero target. And why is it important? I think it's the Grantham Research Institute. I'm going to woefully misparaphrase here, but it's necessary. Inequality is a systemic risk inextricably linked to climate change. And if we don't address that, we don't transition to net zero. So that's risk management. It's necessary. There are dependencies, which we've touched on already. So we can't actually transition to net zero, like I say, without considering the impact on people and communities. So it's necessary. It's the right thing to do in terms of how we make the world a place that we want to live in. And it's the opportunity, which we've also touched on. So transition to net zero is the greatest opportunity from a financial perspective, that's true. And if I can plug impact investing for a second, if we're going to, we're not on target at the moment to reach net zero. I think most people here will probably agree. So every investment is an impact investment, because every investment we need to make is towards trying to tackle climate change and trying to meet those targets. And so this is a huge financial opportunity. And again, for an effective and successful transition, we seek to maximise the opportunities for people and communities and minimise the negative impacts on people and communities.
So actually, it's core to delivery, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It's basically widening that view on this is about how I describe and deliver my net zero, my carbon emission reduction target to, well, what does that actually mean in practice when I look at actually how a business operates? And that would necessarily bring in the people and the communities upon whom that business is dependent and who depend on that business.
That's quite a big ask for corporates and banks. Do they need help from policymakers, multilaterals?
Yeah,
just a little
100%.
bit?
Yeah, I think so. And Nick spoke at length of some of the policy interventions that we need. I mean, they're vast. For a start, we've touched on measurement and reporting challenges. One thing we often get asked is, okay, fine, let's think about social, but it's impossible to do. It's like, well, actually, coming up with ways to measure carbon is really, really, really hard. But we've tried really, really hard, and we are starting to crack it. And really, we just need to pay a bit more attention to some of those social indicators and try really, really hard to crack it. And we're not starting from ground zero here. There are many indicators that organisations are already measuring because it's necessary to their business and or it's best practice. Human rights measurements from the UNGPs, you've got labour rights that are included in the ILO, you've got all sorts of measurements that have come through in the Sustainable Finance Reporting Directive. You've got gender pay gap in the UK. I mean, there are lots of different social indicators that are good starting points, especially when we're thinking about a just transition, which is predominantly about the workforce and about skills and about making communities nice places to live. And then you've got all of this work on environmental and climate targets, and you can take them as a starting point and think, okay, what is the social flip side of that, if you like? So if we were to take TCFD and think about some of these social ramifications of the environmental or climate measures, what are we looking at there? And so when we're talking about measurement and reporting, that's a sort of a place to start, if you like, to try and make the whole concept slightly less daunting. So there are some measures in the policy space there that you can start with. There's also a lot to be done. We talked about the huge upfront cost for organisations to do this. Yeah. There is a significant amount that government or government-owned institutions, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here if anyone's at the British Business Bank or the new UKIP, but for their mandate to be to leverage or mobilise private capital, and for that to be built into their targets and their remuneration structures, so that we've got an incentive of these organisations to de-risk the kinds of investments that are required into the sectors that we are developing or that we need to transform, and that can come in the form of all sorts of guarantees, insurance, and other types of de-risking policies. But it's absolutely critical that those organisations are seen and are acting as, and you'll be able to speak much more informedly than I can on this, as catalysts for this.
Yeah, and I mean the battery example is a great one, because that, the UK Infrastructure Bank is actively supporting that and enabling it to happen. And the SME, the British Business Bank, also is a form of, sometimes second loss capital that enables us to lend alongside what they're trying to achieve. I think the in many ways, we look at the challenge systemically, but organisations operate in a quite focus and respond to incentives and measures.
Yes.
And I think the hardest job that I have in our organisation is trying to filter what we can get people to think about and how to incorporate it into the decision-making process that enables us to get to this kind of inclusive, holistic way of thinking about it that builds in the social and the environmental together. I'm not sure we've found an answer to that yet, but what is really useful is tying it back to a purpose-led strategy that says we're trying to help our customers thrive. And then you have a different type of conversation. We're not just about making maximum returns from our lending, we're actually trying to make the right trade-offs that enable us to do well for our shareholders, but also do well for other stakeholders. And that, I think, is the essence of the transition that we've got to make here. And that, to me, is what intelligent capitalism is. It's a much more nuanced way of thinking about this, whether it's triple bottom line or double materiality, it doesn't really matter. But that purpose-led decision-making sits at the heart of the way in which we make choices, both at a strategic level, but also in an individual day-to-day level in terms of the types of businesses we go for and what we look to do for them.
That's a really interesting thought, because you sort of have to toggle between the individual with the purpose-led strategy, I want to come back to that, and then making sure that public and private sector organisations are essentially pointing broadly in the same direction and are connected. And that bit is like a very complicated Rubik's Cube, isn't it? And for that, the private sector can do lots, but it can't do everything. And there is a piece from what you're saying, actually what you were saying, both of you, that you need some kind of public sector engagement to get, it's not exactly de-risking, is it? It's more getting people to take the next step.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can look at this at sort of lots of levels. I think what was really interesting about the response to the GFANZ announcement and the 130 trillion in Glasgow was that many of the developing countries and emerging markets shrugged their shoulders and said, we can't get access to that money. And they're the ones who need it. And so you need the multilaterals to come in, and you need the bilaterals to come in that facilitate it. And whether that's providing $9 billion for South Africa to move away from coal, or whether it's structuring infrastructure investment in Africa in a way that enables the private sector to come in alongside the multilaterals. It's about how is that risk allocated in a way that enables the capital to flow at the most cost-effective price. You know, that again, I think there is no simple answer to that. But once you've got that frame in your mind, you start to think about the way that works across all of your decisions.
Yes.
And you know, policy is really central to all of this, and that's why you need strong signals that the UK is going to decarbonise its property stock, whether it's retail or commercial. And that's the problem, is that that hasn't been clear enough to the supply chain. So there isn't a supply chain that enables you to get your heat pump, or you know, this building to get, it was probably pretty well decarbonised, this building, or certainly energy efficiency, to get that enabled. And you know, that will be driven then by, it'll be harder for us to lend to energy inefficient buildings, so it'll cost them more. And similarly, as a tenant, you won't be prepared to pay a higher bill because you've got to bear the energy bill. So again, the alignment starts to come together, and you know, if we can use, you know, not to say that the cost of living crisis and the inflation of energy is anything but a disaster, but it can be a facilitator for new technologies and new ways of thinking about reducing long-term costs.
Well, it can, but you probably have to think a bit more richly around what are the structures that you need to create and to enable that demand. Because you could argue that because retrofits pay themselves off over time, everybody ought to be going for it. But in practice, that's just not happening. There's clearly a failure there.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to ask everybody to think about questions. So, and I'm coming to you in like 2 minutes, and if you're asleep, I'll pick on you, because that's just rude. But can I ask, can I ask a question about data? Because I'm hearing a lot of people say, really worried about Scope 3, data is inevitably rubbish. If I put stuff in my targets, if I have a Scope 3 absolute target, I've got no control over it, and I'm just going to get reputational risk, potential litigation risk, God knows what else. Is that fair?
Well, it's a fair concern, and I can completely see, and that's why I think as opposed to scopes 1 and 2, I think there's a degree of really having to learn by doing with scope 3 and being given the permission to learn by doing. So, and I think that's going to have to be reflected in the timeline in which the requirements for net zero transition plan evolve. So there's having the flexibility to report scope 3 on a voluntary basis, and then you go towards mandatory as the learning gets done. But I think that's one of the key areas for guidance. So at the moment, when we engage across our membership, there's strong support for the overall concept of net zero transition plans and doing them, but there's a slight degree of not panic, but concern around, okay, we really need some guidance here in terms of, how do we develop those plans, what kind of templates are we going to have, and that's what the Transition Plan Task Force is looking at right now. But then also on Scope 3, saying, can we have financial regulators who are sort of stepping up here, and sort of potentially even trade groups stepping up here to help guide us as to how can we make the most of imperfect data for the time being and start gradually reporting on our Scope 3 emissions. What should we expect from suppliers and so on? So I think that's going to, there's lots of different kinds of guidance that are needed, but I think the Scope 3 bit is really high up the priority list of where guidance will be particularly important. And then it also goes back, I think, to the strategy behind supply chain engagement. What a lot of our members are doing in order to accelerate their reduction of Scope 3 emissions, but also improve the quality of their data, is to really renew their private procurement strategies.
Yeah.
And use and set basically a reporting challenge to some of their biggest suppliers to report on their emissions, and that's starting to bear fruit in terms of the quality of data they get back. But
that's a slow old process. I mean, I know because we're a supplier, and we're getting questions in relation to what we're doing, our emissions footprint. Well, actually, that's easy enough for us. But you put it all the way down the supply chain. That's a massive cascade of change management. That's going to take time.
But half of businesses already disclose this through the Carbon Disclosure Project, for example.
Big businesses do.
Yeah, but there's, they're now opening up to more SMEs to do it as well. So, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, look, this is really hard, but let's not make the best the enemy of the good.
No, I agree with that.
And we need some standardisation. I mean, that, and the SEC and IASB hopefully will help us get towards that. But in the meantime, let's use the tools that are out there. There's some fantastic organisations that are really thinking hard about this, that can enable us to consistently improve the quality of the data. And we use the PCAF scores. That's the way in which we think about data quality. I mean, they're mostly 4s and 5s, which is obviously the very lowest end of the spectrum. But if we're not improving those, then we're not doing the right things.
Well, maybe that's the way of doing it, but people are concerned, I think, particularly multinationals who've got exposure to multiple different markets. They're concerned in terms of the US, they're concerned in terms of, just attracting litigation. And so it feels to me like there may be a need for, some bridging protection that is realistic about disclosure is going to evolve, our expertise in Scope 3, actually even the methodologies, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, those processes will evolve, and maybe you need a period where everyone is trying by doing without necessarily getting bitten on the bottom.
But I thought Goldman Sachs had a pretty upfront disclosure around this, which said, here are the 5 things that, we should be worried about, and we're not in control of all of this.
Yeah.
So it is, to some extent, about best endeavours and working with others to align that. We've got pages of disclosures around this, which I'm sure you've helped us draft. But so you rely on those to some extent, while at the same time trying to drive that golden thread that improves the quality and helps us get to consistency around it.
Yes, I agree. So, questions from the audience? Oh, you are really wonderful people. Let us go. Shall we start? The 2 gentlemen at the back, and then the lady, one down from her on the left. So up this corridor, 2 there.
I'm Chuka from Escotec in Bristol. My first question is to Bella. You agree that the transition generally have externalities, so there will be losers and winners. So from the public policy perspective, what will you say is fair loss or acceptable loss for the transition to occur? So if we're going to have a transition to net zero, what's an acceptable loss threshold for communities or people for the transition? The second question is to James and Nick. For a credible transition, do you agree that there will need to be a cap on how much banks or other financial service sector players utilize schemes like carbon credits, etc., trying to greenwash their net zero reporting? Because the net zero there doesn't actually mean cutting emissions. It simply means having countermeasures to match whatever positive emissions you have. So it's even an incentive to generate more emissions if you can have countermeasures. So do you think government on this one needs to come up with firm caps that put a threshold to avoid what we have from the IT companies like Apple and Google, who tell you they are net zero in their data centers, but then you have them connected to the same grid that utilizes coal and nuclear? Thank you.
We'll do a couple at a time.
My name is Shubhandi Olatunji from Escotec, and my question goes to James. You took credit for saying that you analyze the stress analysis of coal and the energy, so using the balance sheets and the cash flow. So I want to ask a question: how do you capture the dynamic effect, the dynamic of the carbon in the balance sheet? Now the second question is to Nick. Now on net zero, scope 3, do you feel that we should capture the internal dynamics of the business model, even when we know that we can only report the balance sheet? Then, the next question is,
You're only allowed one or two. Otherwise, other people won't get
is that right? Thank you.
their go. And then can we just do this lady there?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Kate Lamb. I'm the Global Director of Water Security and Oceans at CDP. Thank you for the name check. And congratulations on this fabulous work. It isn't easy, as we said. And it made my heart sing to hear, Bella, your voice is influencing the way in which the TPI are thinking about what a credible transition plan is. Because I think we already also understand that credibility resides in the people that have their voices heard around the table. And so a question I think to you all is, are there voices perhaps not at the table at the moment that you think should be? And what steps can we all as a community help for you to hear those voices, particularly from marginalised communities who's left with an asset, very high carbon emitting asset, that perhaps they're not in the best place to manage? And my second question, if I may, following the lead of my previous question askers, my specialism, of course, is water security. We know, again, that the ability to transition effectively depends on a stable supply of fresh water. We also know that that is not something we can take for granted. So can a transition pathway really be credible if you're not factoring environmental limits in? And how do we ensure that we don't miss the opportunity right now to not set companies on a path of silo thinking because we fail to ask a relatively few simple questions or framing in the transition pathway framework that helps them avoid, even if we don't have all of the answers at this stage. Thank you.
Okay, so should we start with...
Have a whole panel on there, can't we?
Wow.
We're going to start with Bella on sort of the acceptable cost of transition within just transition, and then the lady's question around how are there any voices who are not at the table?
I mean, I don't really know how to answer the first question, except for no one would sit here and say there was an acceptable cost on people for the transition. I think what the whole point of the work around the just transition is to try and avoid having to have that conversation, or not having to have an acceptable cost, but by putting people and communities at the heart of these transition plans, how you ensure that they're not a cost to people and communities, but that they're opportunities to people and communities. So we don't leave communities behind, but we're redetermining and reskilling areas that are in need of high transition. And of course, when it comes to the emerging economies where the impacts of climate change are felt most keenly, but also where the transition needs most to happen. I think to your point about which communities and voices are not at the table, that's where we need to bring those voices to the table. We've already name-checked an initiative, the South African Just Energy Partnership, and there are going to be others launched for other emerging economies. And my understanding is that the people from those countries are the people leading the conversations and bringing the right people to the table. I think in the case of the Transition Plan Task Force, we haven't necessarily had the conversation about which voice is not at the table. I think it's okay to say that there's probably not as much representation from the real economy sectors in some of the working groups as there could be, and we can work on that. I think there's been a struggle necessarily to bring people into all the conversations. I think it's worth asking the Transition Plan Task Force, worth asking ourselves what else we mean by other communities as well. So are there people representing places, for example, rather than just sectors that we should be consulting? Through a series of roundtables that the third working group has been running, the users and preparers, there have been a significant broadening of voices being brought into the conversation, and so I think that's been really, really effective. But I think it's a fair challenge, essentially, that we should be constantly asking ourselves is, have we consulted the broadest range of relevant voices here?
Thank you. Anybody else? Happy?
I just think about the poorest and the most vulnerable who are going to be most affected if we don't kind of address this with urgency and pace. And if you're not thinking about that, you're not human, really. I mean, that's so. But keeping that in your head is the African farmer who's going to be destitute. It's a tough thing to do.
Can I ask you the question that was directed at you, which I think was around the profile of some sectors and some corporates who may appear to be low carbon but may be deriving a lot of power, say for example through the grid, which is khaki at best. And how that's reflected by financial institutions.
Well, the carbon intensity of any business is, or any sector, which is obviously where we're looking at the moment, is a function of the carbon intensity of the grid as we've got it today. We will look at the reduction in carbon intensity over time, and hopefully that will align then with the sourcing strategy that businesses have and enables them to get to that lower carbon intensity more quickly. And in many ways, that's the supply and demand dynamic that enables us to invest more into renewables more quickly. But we can't do it without the policy framework and the market framework to enable that to happen. I think then this is where you do get into some of the challenges around greenwashing, because have you really procured renewable energy? And if everybody's procured renewable energy, does that add up to much more than the 100% of the renewable energy that's available? And only transparency and disclosure will get us to the point where we understand that. And just quickly to answer the carbon credit question, because I think it's the same issue, is we can't carbon credit our way out of this. There's no way that we can do that. So we need to, an SBTI is very clear in terms of what you can take account of. It's really you can only carbon credit your residual emissions once you've got down to the point where you can go no further. And then you can only rely on really high quality carbon credits that are actually verifiable and producing additional carbon emissions reductions than the ones that we've already got. And I think if you can kind of bring all that together, you've got a role that carbon credits can play in facilitating the transition.
So I'll just to address some of the concerns around that, I think people are acknowledging that there is a role for nature-based solutions. The issue is what the role is, and also the robustness of the projects and the verification.
And how you price that, and how you think about the social benefits and the social impact as well. That happens to be why I'm particularly keen on mangrove-based projects, because you get some fantastic biodiversity benefits, very quick carbon capture, but you can also get some great resilience and adaptation benefits that come as a result as well, which helps from the social point of view.
And that would go to your point about thinking more holistically about not just the carbon, but also the interconnected environmental impacts. Let's take some more questions. You, sir, and can we go right at the back, sort of over there?
Thanks. Chris Dorwell from Impacts. So we're doing some work through the Climate Financial Risk Forum that a number of the organisations have been involved in. And I'm trying to get from that really great discussion of transition plans, which kind of brings us up to date on the challenges, to how do we move from the generic to the specific in terms of data requirements. So when last year we kind of came up with a dashboard that had sort of 5 use cases, and I think we can put a few of them to one side. So physical transition risk, CGFI already working on that, financed emissions, we've already spoken about that quite a bit. We kind of know how we can calculate it. Jury's a little bit out on how important these decarbonisation targets are, maybe post the latest GFANZ publication that's now focusing on the real economy. But the challenge is going to lie on how do we work out what the right metrics are for actually the efforts that, James, you talked about some really interesting things NatWest doing to have impact in financing the real economy. What do you measure? Do you measure CapEx? Do you measure avoided emissions? Do you measure just alignment with taxonomies? We've also got to think about how to think about other impacts, like Bella's spoken about. So I think a really clear focus on those social issues. Let's get our teeth into those. And lastly, engagement. That was the other area we covered. I think, Nick, to your point, at the moment I would say we've already made the case for policy gaps need to be filled. We don't need transition plans to tell us that. We know what those are, so we should be getting on with that. But how do we measure the actions that people take on engagement, that companies and financial institutions take on engagement? So if there's any clarity you could offer about the kind of, how do we get from the use case to the specific questions so we can then work out what data we need, that would be great.
Lovely, that was a really straightforward question. You, sir?
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. Actually, my first question before I come to James is actually the audience. Are there any members of a local authority here? Not. Ah, we have one. Hello, how's that? What is that? My question actually is to James. With regard to the appalling state of the inefficient building stock of the UK, the local authorities control a huge stock of buildings. What is preventing NatWest from providing green finance to local authorities? Because there are millions of people in fuel poverty as a result. Isn't it the most extraordinary just transition opportunity?
Thank you very much, sir. And the gentleman who was brave enough to go without the microphone, do you want to project?
This question is for James. What do you think about the idea of having a regulatory capital regime for carbon? For example, a bank has to set aside more regulatory capital, link that to a transition instrument to say that the momentum of transition to the borrower is not. What do you think about the idea that for publicly traded companies, you actually can crystallize the liability of carbon on their balance sheet? So just like a company that goes technically insolvent can't trade anymore, you can do the same thing with carbon.
Lovely. Thank you very much. We'll go for one last round after this. Let's deal with these ones first. Chris's very easy question about data. Who wants to go first on that?
In terms of how do you monitor the progress of the engagement? I mean, I think, so starting with your point about, you know, that we need the transition plans, so that's where the policy gaps are. I agree to an extent. We know where the core policy gaps are, but I do think transition plans can help us get quite a bit more granular, because I think from the government perspective, you're faced with an awful lot of priorities, even within one given sector, and getting a sense of where the key sort of sticking blocks are and which ones you need to solve before tackling others could be really quite helpful, and where the commonalities of problems are between sectors could be really helpful. So I still think it could help us have a more granular perspective on policy gaps. In terms of how do we monitor progress, I mean, I think we are going to have to look at how who is there a regulatory body whose responsibility it could be to oversee the actual implementation of transition plans. I don't think we've really thought about that yet. At the moment, there's talk about financial regulators playing a role in terms of how those are developed, as opposed to how we monitor progress against them. So I think that's a really live question. But I do think we can get going with some of the information that we have available right now. The Committee on Climate Change does produce really detailed carbon budgets and sectoral pathways, which at the very least give you a sense of the proportion or the extent to which different sectors are required to cut their emissions on a 5-yearly basis, and tend to provide you with a 15-year forward trajectory as well. So I think that would be a good starting point whilst we figure out exactly what regulatory tools to put in place. Just on the capital requirement questions, which I know James will be able to answer in a lot more detail, but the only thing I would flag is we published a report a few weeks ago, which was really focused on some of the, where is guidance most needed for net zero transition plans to move forward, and what are the key guidance or regulatory gaps at the moment. And the question that keeps coming up and up all of the time, and is particularly difficult to address, is this issue around what should we not review capital requirements in the sense of, looking at placing more attention on the risks involved when investment pathways are not aligned with the 1.5 degree target. So I do think there's, if I'm not mistaken, I think there's a consultation due at the very end of 2022 run by the PRA, which is going to look at the broader sort of capital requirement framework. And I think that would be a really good moment to ask the question, because there's been a lot of division between brown penalising factor, green supporting factor, and there's no consensus there, but there is a consensus, I think, on the issue that somehow capital requirements do need to be reviewed to better reflect the risk of abiding or not to 1.5 degree pathway. There was one very quick question from the previous round on water. I thought it's a really good point that net zero transition plan over time are going to have to take into account a broader set of environmental issues. That question is already live in a taxonomy, in a green taxonomy discussion, because of the whole do no significant harm rules. But I think over time, I think your point really speaks to the fact that at the moment we're particularly focused on climate for all the reporting and disclosure and the net zero transition plan. Over time, we're going to have to start looking at, even in the context of the UK, our Environment Act targets and some of the nature restoration objectives we have, and make sure that we can start gradually covering everything under the same sort of framework.
Bella, social metrics.
I mean, to an extent, I think it's already been mentioned. I personally, there's a lot of work being done at an international level, at the ISSB, which was flagged. You've got all of the work at the European level. You've got the do no significant impacts in the, I think is it the SFDR? So there's already a range of social metrics, albeit maybe not impacts, that are being measured. I personally think that, the EU should speed up its work on a social taxonomy, even if we are allergic to the idea of taxonomies, and the UK, rather than go ahead and develop their own social taxonomy as they have done with the green, could probably do well to see what's coming out of Europe and largely implement that. And that would probably, I think, go some way to solving the problem, but that could be a divisive comment.
James.
I'll just pick up on a couple of things. I think one on housing support for local authorities. It is a function of local authorities' ability to borrow to some extent, but we do stand ready to provide that. And in fact, we have supported Hexagon Housing Association in issuing a £250 million sustainability bond. We've also got our own social housing bond, which used for our own financing, which we got away at an 8 basis points discount to what a traditional form of fundraising would be for our balance sheet. So, it's absolutely something that we're doing. I think, just to reiterate the point on capital allocation, I think the French, the Bank of France has declared that they are thinking about this. I'm sure that other regulators will come to it. Without giving too much away, I think it would be prudent for any financial institution to run that through its scenarios and to make sure that it was considering what the implication of that might be on its balance sheet.
Okay. Thank you very much. Last round of questions. Very quick, short questions, very quick, short answers, please. Who's got the mic? No? Can you just say your name and can we just shout, because it'll be quicker? 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Hello, my name is Katrina. I'm from Ecolab and I'm a sustainability chemist. Building on Kate's point about water, you were sort of saying that yes, we'll have to look at environmental impacts later on. Actually, the main heat transfer medium used in industry is water. And so if we save water, we're saving energy. If we save energy, we save water. And then if anybody needs to talk to me about sustainable water use, then please do over lunch.
Okay, Andy?
Thank you. My name is Jennifer, representing Stella Limited. My question does go, James, you said your company pulled out funding from some projects earlier on. The EU just reclassified nuclear and natural gas as clean energy. So meaning companies that were dealing with it prior to the reclassification, investments would have been pulled out and they would have been left stranded. And now we are looking at them being reclassified, meaning they need to source for new funding and they need to look for new investments. So how does your company create dynamism in investing for new projects, considering the fact that government policy making is actually dynamic? Thank you.
And who was the third person? There was some. Yes, you, sir. You go.
Thanks. So my name's Charlie Dixon from Vivid Economics by McKinsey & Company. This is to you, James. So you mentioned earlier that finance emissions are important, and we're talking about the future of finance emissions here. And you have a team assessing the credibility of the transition plans of your counterparties. Super important and not an easy job. And we mentioned the role of lots of organisations in helping that. So SEC, the ISSB, and today the TBT, the Transition Plan Task Force. So what could they do to make you and your job easier? Because it's not easy. And also extending to the TNFD when we think beyond climate and nature as well. Thanks.
Okay. Any further comments on water?
Well, just no. I mean, agree with the point. I think what you can do right now in a transition plan is explain, making sure be clear about the environmental impacts, any side environmental impacts of your activities, and making sure that you're not causing negative ones. I think what is going to take time though is to incorporate a lot of the nature restoration targets that are still being developed at the moment. So, in England, for example, the consultation on environmental targets literally just closed, and I think it's going to take a while until they get finalised in life. So I don't think we could get transition plans to cover that from day one, but we should,
could
make
add
sure
on.
We could add on,
Just very quick, I mean, on the taxonomy point, I mean, we have a list of investments that are restricted, so we won't, are prohibited and restricted, and those are things that we won't do. We keep this under review. We're obviously taking a keen interest in GTAG when it comes out and how we're going to incorporate that in terms of the way in which we think about transition finance, which I think is basically what you're describing. And then the other point, I think, was about, what could make our life easier? Well, I think standardization would help. The quicker we can get to common standards and getting people following those, the easier it'll be for us. But recognise that's...
work in progress.
Work in progress, I think, yeah.
Bella, any comments?
No, nothing to add to that. Well, the only thing I would add to the previous comment, though, was, I think you mentioned it, but if between our green taxonomy and our social taxonomy, we could probably find some just transition metrics in the green taxonomy or associated with green taxonomy that would start getting us to where we need to go on the social measurements.
Yeah, I was having a similar thought that actually it'd be good to wrap those in. So, look, you've been really, really good. You've asked lots of questions. Thank you very much. Nobody went to sleep. Lunch now, and then you've all got to come back at 2:45. So enjoy lunch. Thank you very much to our wonderful panel, and get your submissions in on the call for evidence.